Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. We're going to be discussing the topic generative AI or rule-based document automation, which is right for your firm. My name is Brittany Hernandez, and I'm the head of legal innovation at Gavel. I'm also a lawyer. I went to California Western School of Law in San Diego, California, after which I got a master's degree in international film business. I focused on intellectual property and entertainment law. And during my dissertation in my master's degree, I really focused on how we can apply technology, especially AI and legal technology, to help people who can't really afford legal services, especially in that case, the entertainment realm, to get access to lawyers fast and free while still paying lawyers at a competitive rate. So I'm excited to be with all of you today. We have a very packed agenda, and I'm grateful to the California Lawyers Association for partnering with us on this particular webinar. So we're going to be going over a couple of different pieces to this question around generative AI or rule-based document automation, or just automation generally, which would be right for our firm. So there are a lot of questions and issues that come up with this question. So we're going to break this down systematically into these sections. The first is going to be around the scope, the depth, and the application of AI in the legal realm. Then we're going to talk specifically about generative AI. Then we're going to talk about rule-based automation and give some examples there. And then I'm going to tell you the secret of this whole presentation at the end, so stay tuned. I will also give you some case studies and some tips towards the end. So let's dive right in. If you have any questions along the way, just put them in the chat. And if my colleague Trisha can answer them, she'll put them as well. She'll be able to address them. And if not, I'm going to save 10 minutes at the end for questions. So just be sure to put them in the chat. We'll go for about 1 hour. Okay, so let's start with this concept of the scope, the depth, and the application of AI and rules-based automation in the legal realm. So I was able to ask Raymond Blyde of Legal Complex for this particular slide. So what we're looking at here is investment in AI companies around the world in different realms. So it's really interesting to see how much different companies and venture capital companies or firms are investing in AI solutions in the legal space. So we are seeing billions of dollars be raised. And so I think the question that we can all ask is why and how is this being used, right? So I want to show you a couple of examples of how we can scope this out from the perspective of what is included in this concept of AI as applied to legal. There are so many different companies who are starting up in this space that we actually have to create maps to kind of visualize what this looks like. So if everyone can see this, and if anyone can't, let me know. This is a early stage legal tech generative AI landscape map. So this one is really interesting because we're looking at the fact that we can break this concept of AI and the application to the law down really far. Actually, we can go between law firm focus to a corporate focus to an in-house focus to all of these different segments of this world. So we can also then further break this down in scope by law firm operations and kind of separating out the difference between the business of law and the practice of law. So things that we do to maintain the business, such as things like lead generation tools, customer relationship management software, legal practice management software, and so on. Payment software, all these different pieces, things that let us collaborate with our team members and things like that. That's kind of business of law, operations kind of side. And then there's the practice of law, which is doing the actual things that we do as lawyers to prepare documents or provide services to our clients. So here we have, for example, this breakdown of law firm operations. You can see how big the block is for litigation practice, as there are many e-discovery tools and other tools specifically for litigators, corporate practice, other practice areas, research, and so on. You can see how this breaks down slightly differently with a corporate focus around contracting, legal operations and governance, risk and compliance matters, IP management, corporate finance, consumer, and SMB. And I also wanted to show you that this can be broken down in many other ways. So this is just to set the stage to say this can be extremely confusing when you're just trying to figure out what are your responsibilities or duties as they are relating to generative AI and the use of that in your particular firm. And this is an example of how that could break down between legal work, compliance, operations, and productivity in the in-house use case. So you can access these different maps and examples at legalcomplex.com. So that's kind of the scope that we're talking about, is this massive space where there's a lot of investment. We've even seen record numbers for valuation of companies and investment in companies who are developing AI enabled tools. And we're also seeing the maps be massive and confusing. So what is our duty as a lawyer to keep abreast with the changes and the different technologies that are available to us? So this goes into that depth piece. So how far down do we have to travel as lawyers to understand and be in compliance with our duty to maintain competence? So there are about 40 states who have adopted this idea that we need to, as lawyers, maintain and keep abreast of changes and the benefits and risks associated with relevant technology. And so this is just through Model Rule 1.1, comment number 8, which you can reference as well. So there was actually a formal opinion that came down just the other day on July 29th that is from the ABA, saying that lawyers must have a reasonable understanding of the technology, but they need not become experts. So this is really, this is a big relief, right? Because we, especially as I was preparing personally for this presentation, you can go very far down the rabbit hole of AI and all of the things. So it's really difficult to see and learn kind of where is the threshold for what is considered a reasonable understanding. So in this particular presentation, I will do my best to give you the what I would consider sort of a reasonable understanding of the technology. And then you can do additional research as needed if you want to go a little bit deeper. So I think one of the things that we want to understand from understanding how AI relates to us as lawyers in our legal use cases, this particular article is really, really helpful in breaking down what this looks like. And what I can do along with the recording after today's presentation is send you a link to this presentation where all of the images are linked with the different references that I will be showing you throughout the presentation. So you're welcome to just click on those and you can refer to each of these, same here as well, including this one here. I really like this article because it talks about real life use cases for AI in the legal industry. Because I think for me personally, a lot of webinars that I go to and CLEs have talked a lot about sort of like hypothetical scenarios, but they don't necessarily give me concrete examples of what this looks like and how it might be applied in my particular case. So you can spend a little bit of time going through this, but I'll just pull out some examples here. So legal document analysis, and the way that they break this down is the technology that's used if you're interested, things like natural language processing, machine learning. They give you an example of a system such as Kira Systems and what they're using it to do. So in this case, Kira Systems uses AI to analyze and extract relevant information from legal documents, improving the efficiency of due diligence processes. And what are the benefits? Saves time, reduces human error, and enhances the accuracy of document review. There are a lot of different examples here as well around predicting legal outcomes. So if you want to kind of see how, what the percentage or of likelihood it is that you'll be successful in a case, automated legal research, contract generation and management. And like I said, they give you different examples throughout of different companies that you can take a look at. What's interesting about this one in particular, legal chatbots for client interaction, is it illustrates this point that consumers are also interacting with AI, not just you as a lawyer. So not only are we competing against other lawyers for clients, but we're also now competing against AI companies who are trying to address situations for clients as well. So it's something to be abreast and knowledgeable about how consumers are using legal products and also being aware of the risks that they might have associated with that as well. For example, I was testing this one time and I asked ChatGPT to produce a will template for me and it gave me one. And I was like, whoa, that might be a little a little bit of an unauthorized practice of law here, we want to make sure that those are the things that, lawyers are preparing for their clients with all of the context and information about their, beneficiaries and heirs and so on and assets. So it's really something that we should be aware of for our clients' protection as well as for our own internal protection. So just a quick note there as well. So I think e-discovery is one that's probably most well known just because I think it started pretty early and is used really heavily. But other things too around things like fraud detection might not be as top of mind. Things like risk assessment and compliance, but also things like jury selection analysis, translation services, sentiment analysis, voice to text transcriptions, and client relationship management. So you can see how this is applied in lots of different contexts within the law. And you can also, in this example, kind of go through and see some different names of companies that are providing solutions like that. So let's go now into what is generative AI. I'll just quickly stop here and ask Trisha if there's anything in the chat that I should be aware of. Everybody's tracking so far.
Yes, everyone's tracking great. We do have a question here about ethic opinions on using AI and any of its many uses. In particular, are there any California opinions that you're aware of?
Not specific to California as of yet. This particular formal opinion only just came out a few days ago, so I'm sure there will be some responses. So I would say actually just watch that space because I'm sure we'll see something come down as a response pretty soon. So I would say that's the best we can do right now, but not specifically California as of yet. But do keep a lookout for that, knowing that this particular opinion just came out a few days ago. Okay, if there aren't any other questions that I can address right now, let's keep moving forward. So now we're going to go into this piece. Now that we have an understanding of the scope of what we're talking about, and that is quite massive, and then also the depth to which we need to actually dive into that pool of maps and things, we're going to just think about what do I actually need to know as a lawyer in order to apply generative AI and to understand it. So what is it? So traditional AI, I'm going to look at this section over here on the top left. So traditional AI and machine learning systems recognize patterns in data to make predictions. So generative AI is distinct in that it goes beyond predicting and it actually generates new data as its primary output. So they give some examples here of imagine receiving the full text for a speech in just seconds after giving something like a chat GPT a prompt that describes your idea. I'm doing a speech about generative AI and rule-based automation. Give me a 500-word script on what to say. I didn't do that. I actually did all the work by myself, but you could do that. So they can also generate things like music, art, images, video from text-based descriptions. I actually had my partner who was playing around with like TikTok and so on. He showed me this app where you can put in your prompt, make a video about the top 5 destinations in London. And it's going to pull images and it's going to pick a voice and it's going to put over the text and it's going to create this 2-minute video that you can then post on TikTok. So it's really interesting what the different applications are. I could give another example of developing a business strategy through conversational back and forth prompting with a generative AI tool. We're actually going to do some practical examples today as well to illustrate these. But first, let's understand just a little bit more at the higher level how this works. So I'm going to have us go to this particular article. So actually, this company, SAS, has some very good articles about the history of AI and how it works. And it breaks it down really nicely into what is it? Why does it matter? What's the history? How is it used today? Who uses it? How does it work? And what you should do. They have videos and all sorts of stuff. So it's really helpful. And under this section, it's helpful for us to contextualize how it breaks down. I love to categorize things and see what the different branches are. So when we think about generative AI, some of these examples could be DALL-E, if you've heard of that, where it produces images from text inputs, text generation, as we talked about with ChatGPT, Google Bard chatbot, and then also other examples here. So there are 3 main types of generative technologies. We're going to focus specifically on large language models, but it's just kind of, at least for me, it's helpful to, before we get too far down into the branches of where we are living in this space, just to know what are the high level categories, and then we'll kind of go deeper into each one. So digital twins are interesting in that they're virtual models of real life objects, and that build from data in the real world or historically, and then they form a feedback loop and so on. I'm not going to just read this whole thing, but just it's more important to just understand the three like higher level concepts. So digital twins, large language models, and synthetic data generation, which is more around like fake data that you're using to simulate something that you can actually kind of reproduce and kind of understand different probabilities and patterns. So we're going to focus in on large language models today, but before we do, I think it's helpful to understand a few more foundational terms before we get to that place, because there's a lot that goes behind this, but I'm going to keep it pretty high level as much as we can. However, these are the terms that come up quite a lot that I think would be helpful for lawyers to understand. They are artificial intelligence as a general concept, machine learning, neural networks, deep learning, natural language processing, LLMs or large language models, and then this idea of a transformer model. So let's go into each one in turn, starting with artificial intelligence. And I know I kind of, started with Gen AI and then I'm going back to the top, but I hope you'll track with me on this. So essentially, artificial intelligence is a branch of computer science focused on creating machines capable of performing tasks that typically would require human intelligence. So these are things like learning, problem solving, perception, language understanding. So these are designed to handle complex operations, often mimicking or even surpassing human capabilities in specific domains, like the ability to generate an entire speech within 20 seconds versus me slaving over hours and hours of data trying to figure out what to say. The development has led to significant advances in various fields, but it also includes the legal sector and offers those innovative tools for enhancing work processes. So that's kind of that general artificial intelligence umbrella over lots of different branches that go underneath that, which include things like robotics and computer vision and all sorts of really cool expert systems and so on. So we're going to talk about some more specific types around things like machine learning. So machine learning is that subset of AI where AI is sort of at the top. Then we have machine learning and all those other branches I mentioned. And this moves beyond sort of like a rules-based system, right? This involves training AI systems to learn from data, identify patterns, and make decisions with minimal human intervention. So what this could look like in law firms, for example, is machine learning algorithms can analyze past case outcomes, legal precedents, and other relevant data to offer predictive insights. So what might happen based on this past information? It could assist in things like legal research or even forecast case results. So unlike rules-based, which we're going to talk about in a moment, this adapts and improves over time as it processes more and more data, making it more dynamic and capable of handling nuanced and evolving legal scenarios. So that's kind of one of the distinctions we can make here. Neural networks is an interesting one as well. So if we think about how artificial intelligence works, as I mentioned, we have kind of different branches underneath that umbrella. And so we have things like machine learning, deep learning, and neural networks. So for the neural network piece, this is a type of machine learning that's made up of interconnected units, as you would imagine your neurons are in your brain. And that processes information by responding to external inputs, relaying information between each unit. So this requires multiple phases and the data to find connections and drive meaning from undefined data. And then deep learning is going to be this piece here, which uses huge neural networks. So you see how these are all interconnected and linked. So neural networks as a subset of machine learning, and then deep learning using neural networks. So that's why these concepts are important, because we're understanding sort of where they fit within the overarching concept of artificial intelligence. So they use the neural networks with multiple and many layers of processing units, and they can take advantage of the advances in those computing powers, improved training techniques to learn complex patterns in large amounts of data. So this would be things like image and speech recognition. Okay, so now we're going to go into natural language processing. So in natural language processing, what we're talking about is another aspect of AI, which is relevant in particular to the legal industry. So what this is able to do is it enables the AI to understand, interpret, and generate human language in a meaningful way. So what this would look like in the legal context is for things like analyzing legal documents, processing contracts, and assisting in drafting legal briefs. So by processing sort of these large volumes of text quickly and accurately, what NLP can do is save you time and reduce the likelihood of human error. So it's really, really helpful for lawyers and legal researchers. Okay, so I said we were going to focus in on large language models. And this concept actually kind of brings everything together for us from all that we've talked about before. So let's go into this piece as well. So what large language models are, and I'm sure many people have sort of like heard this term, but we're going to bring it all together with those concepts we just learned. So, and as I mentioned too, I will be sending out the recording and the slides. So if I'm going really fast, just know that you're going to have time to sort of like slow down, pause, look at the articles. We just want to get the information in so that you can have the broader, focus and picture of what we're talking about when we get to some of the examples and practical examples that I'll show you. So when we talk about large language models, these are in that subset of machine learning models, and they can comprehend and generate human language text. But what they do is they analyze massive sets of language. So that's why they're called large language model. This is like billions or even trillions different data points that they're analyzing in order to spit out the different text generated for you. So it's a type of artificial intelligence that can recognize and generate text among other tasks. They're trained on huge sets of data, and they're built on machine learning, specifically a type of neural network called transformer model. I really love this because it really brings together all the things that we've just talked about: artificial intelligence, machine learning, neural networks, deep learning, natural language processing will all come into play here. I'll talk about transformer model in just a second. But to kind of summarize this a little bit simpler, it's just a computer program that's been fed a lot of examples so that it can recognize and interpret human language or other complex data. And what they're doing is they're being trained on that data that they've gathered things from like the internet, different gigabytes worth of text. But the quality of the samples impacts how well they will learn the language. So that's something we'll talk about when we go into pros and cons of each one. And you can see that also deep learning comes into play here. And so on. So you kind of get this example and this concept of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and how these things are related. And then I'll finally just quickly go over a transformer model. So this is a type of deep learning model that was introduced not that long ago, actually. What's interesting to see as well is that the model was first described in a paper called Attention is All You Need. And the release of the paper is considered a huge moment in the field. And so from that, we were able to see such a widespread application of LLMs in our sort of daily lives as consumers. As I mentioned, like clients are using ChatGPT, and also, companies and legal tech startups are using GPT 4.0, for example, to create different, custom models on top of that. So these are some kind of higher level concepts that we just want to understand in order to go into more of what are the pros and cons of these, knowing now a little bit of the base of what these terms mean. So when we talk about pros and cons, you can see this article is super helpful around the pros and cons and advantages and downsides of something like a machine learning system or model. So for example, some of the pros here are going to be adaptability, self-learning, this ability to learn from previous information, to be trained, and also the scalability that comes with that. Some cons we can think about or should be aware of as lawyers are dependence on the quality of the training data. A lot of the time, the garbage in, garbage out concept applies here. Complexity, it can be also expensive and complex to implement and maintain. And then also limited adaptability. So they go into each of these pros and cons in this article a lot deeper, but I just think for our purposes, if you want to go deeper into each of these, I'll just refer you to the slides and this link that you can click on here. And you can kind of go through each of these in turn, but it's more just helpful to understand what the high level pros and cons are versus, and then we'll go into when we get to the rules-based aspect. We'll talk about the pros and cons of that as well. So let's talk now about ways to mitigate the risks. So when I was thinking about the structure of this presentation, as I said, I really wanted to start off with some foundational concepts and the scope and what our duties are, and so on. And when I think about what our duties are, is to understand the pros and cons, the benefits and risks in the language of the rule, and then how we can understand these enough to mitigate them for when we're using them in our practices, or to be able to understand what's happening if a client comes to us having tried to generate something on ChatGPT and they're bringing it to us and we're looking at it like, what happened here? This rule doesn't even exist that they're referring to. And that can be things like hallucinations, for example, which is probably the most most well known right now, especially in the legal field, just because of the case where a lawyer had used ChatGPT to prepare for his case, and then came up with, I think, 6 different cases that didn't exist that he was relying on. So just to know that there are drawbacks to using AI, and if you understand what those are, you can learn how to mitigate them, which is the crucial piece for us here. So hallucinations are incorrect or misleading results. So these can be caused by many different things, including things like insufficient training data, incorrect assumptions made by the model, or biases in the data used to train the model. So we'll talk about bias next. So bias is obviously this idea that the data set that the model is trained on, in our case, might be the internet, right? The Internet of Things. There's everything from that has ever been published that is available to it. It's getting it's getting trained on. Now, humans are biased. So when we write articles, maybe, for example, we're always, maybe, without even realizing it, not doing it on purpose, but maybe when we write an article and we put that online, we're always referring to the person that we're referring to as he. So that kind of biases in a gender context. Maybe there's biases around race or ethnicity, gender, and all sorts of different things. So when the data that it's trained on is biased, then the answers may also come out as biased. So it's just something to be aware of. And then the other piece is around this concept of dirty data. So this refers to data that's incomplete, inconsistent, or contains errors. So, we want to take advantage of the power of machine learning and all of the capabilities of LLMs. But if we're training it on data that's incomplete, or we've put in a template, for example, that we want to train it on, but we have not given it a perfect example of what the ideal output should be, then it's going to be learning and training on data that's inconsistent, incomplete, or contains errors. So this can include things like missing values, duplicated records, or inaccuracies of information. So this could be human error. This could be outdated systems or lack of standardization. So one of those things, as far as mitigating those risks, especially for dirty data, could be to reverse this part, right? Give it ideal information, give it ideal templates, have standardization, double check information, and so on. But a specific example I want to point out around things that you can do to mitigate these risks is something called retrieval augmented generation. So retrieval augmented generation is this idea that you are actually limiting the scope of training data and the data that the system pulls from in order to give you, accurate information and outputs. So for example, there's a video of our founder, Dorna Mwini, who goes into what is RAG in AI, what does it mean, and how can we utilize it in the legal context. So you're welcome to check this article out on our website as well. But essentially what it's doing is it's saying, it's 2 steps, right? We have retrieval and generation. So upon receiving a query, the RAG system searches a predefined data set or the internet to find relevant information. Then the generation part, upon receiving or using the retrieved information, the model crafts a detailed, nuanced response. And this step ensures that the output is not only informed by accurate data, but also presented in a clear and coherent manner. So this is a really important, piece of this, because this can be used in the legal context for legal research, document drafting, case analysis, and client interaction. And what this allows us to do is create higher efficiencies, accuracy, and innovation, but also this idea that it reduces or mitigates the risk of things like hallucinations, bias, and dirty data, because you're able to use a system that allows you to actually limit the scope of things that it's looking at in order to produce its outputs. Finally, one thing I want to mention here too is there's another great article around retrieval augmented generation and the differences and similarities between that and fine tuning. So there's a section here called "How does RAG compare to fine tuning?" So essentially, this what it is doing is basically it helps it grasp the nuances of legal language, terminology, and concept. So it's constantly like fine tuning the data and the training that's happening. So it's allowing the model to adapt its pre-existing knowledge to better suit the nuances and specifics of a particular domain or set of proprietary data. So this is the idea, for example, of instead of the model, really pulling off of everything in the world and all of the hallucinations and biases that can, be a result of that. Instead, you're able to provide the model with your own information and your own things like templates and data sets and so on that it can look at and pull from in order to produce more accurate information and custom to your way of working. So what does this look like in real life, and how accessible is this to you as a lawyer today, really? I always think about this as well from my own perspective of like, okay, that's nice. Like, how do I use it? Like, what does that look like? And so I wanted to give you a couple of examples of what this would look like, and to also illustrate that you're actually already using this. There's an interesting YouTube video by Google that talks about how they've actually been using or implementing generative AI in Google search engine since 2001. And the example they give is of them using it for correcting mistakes in spelling. So when you type in a search engine and you don't know how to spell a certain word, and so you write it how you would hear it, it's going to autocorrect that for you, or it knows what you're talking about, even if you didn't spell it correctly and it's not exactly correct. It's learning that people make mistakes when they type things, and so it's going to help refer to things that it knows that you're trying to say. Also, there is a new feature in Google that if you type something like, for example, why should lawyers use artificial intelligence? It's going to bring up all of these reasons and answer the question for you as if you were using a chat GPT, for example, instead of just giving you links to articles that have been, written in the past and made available for you that you could refer to. So prior to this, obviously, you would just see the sponsored stuff first, and then you would see, whatever comes up next. And now it's actually answering the question for you as Gavel. So this is an instance or example of generative AI that you're using even today. Another one is Softer, for example. So let's say, for example, you have Softer is a website where you can build things like client portals and websites. So let's say you want to build out something, a place or a client portal for your particular clients to go to pay their bills or see the status of their case or whatever else. What you can do is you can say, I'm going to create a new app with generative AI, right? I want to build a client portal, an internal tool, a directory, or a membership platform, in this case, a client portal. So I can say something like, here's what the app should do. This is a client portal, so you're giving it a prompt. So this is around like what you hear around prompt engineering is how can we craft a prompt that is specific enough to let the system know what we want to have happen on output. So in this case, we get 200 characters to explain what we want to do. We could say something like a client portal for a law firm that has clients in the real, in estate planning, and they want to be able to track their information or whatever else. Once you type in your prompt, you just say generate your app, and then it's going to give you a suggested app name, in this case, reseller zone. And so it gives you the description or the prompt that you put in. You can choose a theme and some colors, such as modern, playful, professional, creative, or retro. Pick a color and say generate your app, or you can try another prompt. And then it's going to actually build out a template that you can use and just edit as you need. So that's in that context. But another one would be, what if you wanted to add, for example, on the website that gets created, a way for your clients to ask you questions, but have them be answered mostly by, generative AI, for example, but with your inputs. So Softer has a free plan, Zapier has a free plan. So you can actually just try this today and see, how it works, how you can build it yourself, how would you use this in your own firm. And it gives you this safe place to kind of play and experiment and try different things with a low risk of, don't put, you're not putting like any client information. You're just trying to see like how it works to interact with generative AI in the context of things like creating a client portal, or in this case, let's create a chatbot, right? So I created an example here where if you want to create a new chatbot, you just say create. And when you go to the builder of this particular example, you'll see something like this, where you give it some instructions or you give it a prompt. So I have said, you are a human lawyer. You are gathering some initial information about a potential new client. Your practice areas include copyright, trademark, and entertainment law. You want your greeting to be static or generated. In this case, I want it to always start with saying, hi there, what's your first and last name? The AI model that we're using is transparent here, either OpenAI GPT 3.5 Turbo or 4.0 Mini. You can see under the knowledge section that if you have a paid plan, you can actually do what we talked about with that kind of RAG concept of adding in your own tables or tailor your chatbot to your particular business. So that's something you can think about as well. Text files or other type of information you can add as your knowledge base that it pulls from here. You could also do things like add logic. So I can say, for example, when a user gets a response, I want you to show a button with text that says submit my current information. And I'm the one who has built this myself, just getting to play with the concept of how do I build a chatbot with generative AI capabilities that I could put on my website, either by a link or by embedding it. And so we can kind of also, in this particular case, for Zapier, you can connect it to what's called a Zap that you create, where Zapier allows you to connect different applications together, even if they are not, those companies have never spoken to each other to have an integration, where I can send information from, let's say in this case, what's collected here into another system such as Gavel. So in this case, we can also have a picture added. We can customize the logos and the colors and whatever else to match our branding. Conversations, I can see the past conversations. So in this case, I had interacted with it where I said, hey, what's your first and last name? They said Jane Doe. Nice to meet you, Jane. Can you please provide me with a brief overview of your legal issue or concern? I'm a student filmmaker trying to figure out how to protect my short film, and blah, blah, blah. Provide me with some details about your film, et cetera, et cetera. You can get more advanced by indicating how creative you want this particular model to be, give it a name, have a message, and so on. So these are some examples of how you can engage with practicing the use of generative AI and how this might be relevant to your particular firm in a low risk and a very cost-effective way, because you can have a free plan and play with these. So before we go into rules-based automation, I'm just going to quickly check the chat. Let's see. I think there's quite a lot of stuff going on here. Trisha, maybe do you want to tell me if there's something I can address? But it looks like Dorna and Mike Smith are also here answering some questions as well.
Yes, it sounds like we're doing well. We do have one from Donna about asking about how this applies to submitting documents to court, use of Westlaw, and perhaps some law work.
Okay, so as far as like submitting information to the courts, I would say that you would want to have a system that allows you obviously to review. So one of the things that's brought up in the case of the formal opinion 512 by the ABA that just came out, they talk about not only sort of some of the things that I pointed out, but they also talk about your other duties, such as like the duty to like supervise and so on, and to like candor to the courts and things like that. So whatever you do end up using, what I would suggest is that even though there could be a way that you could, auto send something, via to the court via post or via some other means, you want to have a step before that allows you to review all the information for accuracy before you submit that. specific examples around, I think you said Westlaw and another example, I would refer to their particular sites and maybe speak directly to their customers, their customer service team to ask them. And I'm going to actually give you some questions in the different section of this presentation that you can ask these different providers to see if they're like in compliance and what they're doing with your data. So what I would say is make sure that there's a step before any submitting to a court, because then you're going to be in compliance with your ethical duties in many different ways. And then the other piece would be around speaking directly, to emailing or going through their chatbots to understand, or even their like help centers or whatever else, to understand what that specific vendor is doing with your data and how they're protecting your information. Okay, perfect. So I can't believe how fast the time goes. We only have 18 minutes. I want to make sure we have a little bit of time for more questions. I'm going to go into the second piece, which is going to be around rule-based automation. So what is it? So rules-based automation excels in areas of law with well-defined procedures and standardized documents, for example. So in estate planning, this type of automation can streamline the creation of wills and trusts by ensuring that specific clauses are correctly and consistently applied according to the latest laws and regulations. Similarly, in real estate law, lease agreements, sales contracts, and closing documents, these can be automated to include standard provisions, which minimizes drafting time and reduces the risk of human error. So this is a really good example here from a Gavel article that you can refer to as well. That kind of is a summary of this full webinar, but I have a lot of different nuances as well. But this is a good recap if you want to refer to this one here around what it is. So what we're talking about here is this idea that we're creating systems that are following predefined rules to perform a task. So this is distinguished from what we mentioned around generative AI, in that, for example, you could have a different output every time you give a prompt, for example. So in this case, if we want to prepare a document and we have a template that we want to have formatted and have the language be consistent every single time, then we should use rule-based automation systems for that particular, for that particular task, as in contrast to something like a generative AI tool, which will give you some kind of novel clause here and there in your document. And maybe that's not what you want because you're trying to prepare something that is standard in your particular field or in your practice. So let's say, for example, you have this document and you can put a lot of complexity and logic and conditions, but the difference between the generative AI piece and the rules-based document automation piece is this idea that you have more control and consistency and predictability in your ability to prepare forms and different kinds of automations in your firm. So that's the distinction we want to make here. Is generative AI is going to be more creative and coming up with things that are novel or analyzing past information and making predictions. Whereas in rules-based automation, we want to know exactly how this is going to come out with no room for creativity as far as like the AI system, maybe our own creativity as the lawyer who created the documents, but we want to know that every single time the person's name will appear here, today's date will appear here, that when we go to the conditions aspect, we can say things like only show this entire paragraph when something like service-connected disabilities, the question that's asked around whether they have one of these, is answered none of the above, or is not none of the above, or whatever the case may be. And with Gavel, for example, you can do this directly inside of your own legal templates. So in this case, I have what's called a workflow that I created within Gavel that allows me to, in this case, I'm referring to this workflow here. So when you have a Gavel account, your dashboard looks like this, where you can see all of the different workflows that you've created. And I'll show you what a workflow is in a second. And you can run them or edit them, share them with clients, and so on. So what a workflow is a set of questions and answers that have conditions that you set and control around them that will show or hide different things or insert different what are called variables into your documents, depending on the inputs that you give it. Now, so what that means is you have control and predictability around what happens here. And you don't have to learn how to code in order to do that, because all you have to do is know the logic that you want to have happen. In this case, for example, I only want this paragraph to show in the case that service to connected disabilities, the answer to this question is none of the above. So I can just say in the Gavel word add-in, insert condition, and it's going to do that for me. I can fix spacing if I want to. And then if I want to make any changes to this in the future after I've used this a bunch of times and maybe some aspect of the law changes, all I need to do is make whatever change I want to make. And then I just come down here to this section on the bottom right where my cursor is here. And I just say select which document I want to replace. I select it and then I say update and gavel. And those changes are reflected in the workflow. So that's the difference there, is the level of ability to predict and control the outcome of what is generated by the system. So let's go over some of the pros and cons generally now that we have an understanding of the differences and similarities between sort of Gen AI versus rule-based automation. So similar to the one that I showed you before, there are some advantages and some pros and cons around this. So the pros would be accuracy. So we know that every single time we use a system like Gavel, the document that is generated or the outcome that we get is going to be accurate because we are the ones that coded it ourselves, or coded it or tagged, you could say. We are the ones that put the conditions in, so we know exactly where they are and how they operate, and we can change them as needed. So it's really easy to use because, as I showed you, you're able to directly within your Word documents go through and put exactly where you want things to go without having to become a developer. Now, so remember back to what I was saying about the formal opinion, in which said that we don't have to be experts on everything. We have to be experts in our domain, but have a reasonable understanding of what these tools can do, the pros and cons of each, how to mitigate those risks, and so on. The other one is speed. So the fact that you don't have to learn how to code in order to use these makes it really easy to set up. So as I showed you, you're automatically able to interact with your documents. And also in this piece, you're able to just say something like new workflow. You can start with questions or documents, and it's going to take you over to this editor. So let me go into this example here. So the idea here, as I mentioned, around speed is that ability to quickly automate your documents and put them into practice right away. So for example, in this case, I'm able to say new workflow. I can say start with questions. I can say I'm going to just have this be a demo for the CLA webinar. I'll say create. It's going to take me straight over to our what's called the editor. I can do things like add questions, and all I need to know is what type of question needs to happen here. So maybe, yes.
We need to see the screens again. If you would like to share your slides again.
Okay, thank you. Okay, perfect. So in this case, you can see that I have this, I'll go back to this section here. So in this case, I was just showing that you say new workflow, you say start with questions, and then that's going to take us over into the editor where you're able to do what's called rapid development, meaning that you're able to quickly do things like add a question where you can choose what is asked of the person who's interacting with this, either internally for a team member, such as a lawyer or a paralegal, for example, who's preparing a document, versus, let's say, a client-facing workflow where you actually send the link to or assign this particular workflow to a client and they fill out the information, such as when you're collecting information about shareholders, or if you're collecting information about beneficiaries or trustees or or guardians or whatever else. So all you need to do is say, something like, what is your name? Like say your first name. And then you can give this something called a variable called something like client first name. We can change this to welcome, for example, and then we can say save and run. And now this is something that we can use right away. We could take this link and give it to someone else, for example, such as a client or to a paralegal or whatever else. And we can also brand this or customize the logo, customize the colors and the font to match our particular firm, for example. Okay, so let's go into, so there are going to be a lot more examples that I can show you outside of Gabble. The first thing that I ever did was interact with something called Q&A markup, which is a open source or free tool that you can use to create a sort of sequence bot where it looks like a chat GPT kind of interface, but you actually are controlling the output. So in the case of mine that I created back in 2020, I did this around copyright law and whether, if you were registering a new work, what kind, how many, and whether, which copyright application might be right for you based on your answers, such like this. So click here for examples, you can put in links and so on. So that's a good place to start as well with Q&A markup and a Gabble, for example, because they're affordable ways that you can engage in rules-based document automation or rules-based automation in a chat interface for you to get started and try out and compare and contrast that to the examples I showed you around using AI to create a website or to add a chatbot or whatever else. So let's go into this last section around the secret, case studies, and tips. So this will answer some of the questions around questions I should be asking vendors and things like that. So the secret here is that you can use generative AI and rule-based automation together in your practice. An example of that could be something like Gabble Blueprint, which is a way of allowing you to create very quickly these types of automations. So for example, I showed you the example of starting from scratch or starting with questions. Let's say that you want to start with documents to make it even quicker and easier for you to automate something like this, which is an anti-coercion insurance disclosure template. And you want to be able to just quickly and easily automate this. So we can combine the power of generative AI to give us a starting place, such as in this example. I'm just going to drop my document, and you can drop more than one, for example, if they are in a set and you want them to be created in a single workflow. You could also have the option to separate different things out, such as if you needed HIPAA authorization and a trust and whatever else in a bundle, you can do that. But in here, what we're seeing is that the model that we're using at Gabble has recognized that borrower name here appears twice in this document, here and here. So it's going to combine those for us into a single question, which is what is the borrower's name? And if we want to make any changes, as I mentioned around that control piece, we're able to go in and say, what is the lender's name? We can change the variable and the variable type. We can accept or reject this as needed. And then all we need to do when we're done is draft the workflow. And it's going to make it even easier for us to automate this document because it's also going to insert the variables that we created that allow us to interact with our document from the workflow inputs. It's able to do that right away for us without us having to even touch our documents, which is even better, right? So the more that we can save time, the better. So here in this case, what we can see is the question that has the variable, in this case, the question of what is the lender's name that has the variable of lender name is going to automatically get input into this section for us. This has even stayed bolded in this case from a formatting perspective. Borrower name is consistent here and here. And all we have to do now is review, edit, save, and run, and we're good to go. So that's how that works from the secret of you can have these things combine with each other in order to make it even more powerful. Because, in the premise of this, generative AI or rules-based automation, this kind of pits these two things against each other and says you can use one or the other. But the secret is you can use both of them in your practice and even within the same tool, such as Gabble Blueprint. There are lots of different different companies and firms that are using this in different contexts. Here are some examples. When you get the slides that I can send out in the recording, like the email that I'll send out with the recording, each of these are linked so you can see these examples as you click on them. And you'll be able to see how these types of rules-based systems and generative AI being used in combination have made it to where companies are able to offer different types of what are called legal products and different tiered plans, for example, in the case of Hello Divorce, so that there's more price certainty for the end consumer as well. From the standpoint of having some case studies, a cool example of how a company or in this particular example, an organization has combined the use of a chatbot style interface for landlord tenant rights with the concept of rules-based automation. So in this case, somebody can interact with Rennie, their chatbot, about their housing matter. And what it will do is, if it's recognizing that you need a document to be generated, such as a letter to the landlord letting them know that you have bed bugs in your apartment, for example, then it will direct you to a Gabble workflow, which allows the person to go ahead and put in their information and generate a letter right away. So that's an interesting use of that, especially in the access to justice context. Divorce as well is the one that I showed you, where they can have different tiered and flat fee processes for clients. And then I finally want to leave you on this piece, and then we'll go to quick questions around questions that you can ask an AI or legal tech vendor. So some questions you want to think about, and this is for that question about, Westlaw and other vendors, for example, is how is my data handled in your partnership with AI models? So as you can see, you have Gabble that's using a model to use generative AI. What uses does your software have for my data? This is all part of our ethical duty as lawyers to protect our confidentiality. For example, where and how is my data stored? What are my rights regarding data retention and deletion, especially for people who want to comply with GDPR or the CCPA, for example? What security safeguards are you taking to assess risk? And what are you doing to stay on the forefront of AI? So I do know that we, went a little bit long. So I want to have just a few minutes for questions, and then I'll wrap this up. How are we looking in the chat?
Pretty good. We have one here about, can you copyright your output after using specific generative AI or machine learning platforms?
Yeah, so this is a really big question, obviously, in the intellectual property space. I think you'd have to look at all the different decisions that have come down around it and also look at the specific terms of use for each different one that you want to use. So if there's, any explicit language, for example, that says that you own the copyright output, for example, in a particular tool, then you would have more certainty around this question. But as Dorna mentioned here, AI generated content is not copyrightable. So something to keep in mind as well. Okay, since we only have about a minute left, I'm just going to leave up a slide where I can share my contact information if you'd like to get in touch. And then also to share that Dorna, who answered that question and a couple of other questions in the chat, you can actually follow her at Dorna@Gabble on Instagram. And this is a really good resource. A lot of the stuff that I actually said is from a lot of her content, where she goes into, for example, those questions around, what you should ask when you're talking to different vendors and so on. I'd also just like to quickly thank Trisha for helping me out, and for a couple of people in the chat answering questions, and also to the California Lawyers Association for helping us on this particular webinar. So thank you all so much. Trisha, if you can close us out, that'd be great.